Writing is hard. You start with communication, right? What are the right questions to ask? What content block are they engaging with? What are they clicking on? What happens after that? They need to understand why they're doing it. Content creation is not flip a button and it's on. How do we recommend content? Not just create it, not just measure it. Word vomit onto a page. They're going to learn it eventually. Are they actually converting and using it? I put as much as I can down there. What you're really trying to look at is customer behavior. What are they doing? Are they actually interested in what you're creating? What are your levers that you can pull to basically promote your message? I think that based on the audience, sometimes you have to assume that they don't know.
We're just going to jump straight into the conversation. Tell me a little bit about your content marketing philosophy and the impact it can have on a business.
Yeah, so I started my career in journalism, and content really needs to be timely, relevant, and sometimes newsworthy. So the philosophy is really around the target audience. It really addresses the pain points, reducing friction, and figuring out what content formats work there. So basically, I start with a competitive analysis, see how other content has been successful. And along with the qualitative, I also like to think about content attribution, conversion statistics, and measuring your work. My goal is to build out attribution models to measure the entire customer journey from the first touch to then product adoption in customer success. So there are a few questions I like to ask myself when building out some of this content. So when I look at attribution, we look at what systems do you use. The traditional is more of the Google Analytics structure, and then what needs to happen eventually for attribution to be complete throughout the customer journey is connecting it to an internal system like Mixpanel, Snowflake. It really depends on your data warehouse. The second question that I like to ask myself is, what data do I want to measure? What are the right questions to ask? So basically, if you are doing an email campaign, you with some of the vanity and engagement metrics from open rate to click through rate on a content CTA. I then really want to measure on, the page that we send them to, what content block are they engaging with? Once we know what content is working, which piece that we create is driving them to log in. So basically, the measurement framework that I'm working with really addresses these questions and connects disparate systems that normally can't go through the entire customer journey and gives us a bigger picture of how to gauge that customer behavior and how they're interacting with content. Um, a few examples, we have on page attribution. So, what are they clicking on? We have the pre and post sale of how long after a customer buys a product are they actually converting and using it? And then what types of content are really increasing retention and mitigating churn for the audience? So,
I love that because it is such a difficult thing to really think about. And I want to take a step back, right? So we're going to get into the more practical side now without giving me any specific details because I know that there's probably a lot that can't be said. What does that content analysis look like? And then how are you thinking about as you're going through the process, what that full funnel looks like, all the way to the retention part?
yeah. So, in building that, the measurement framework, I don't have it fully worked out at my company
Okay.
yet. We're really, really trying to get it done. But as far as throughout the customer journey, we look at, when they buy the product, what happens after that. I have a team of people that I work with that really address, the welcome motion for customers and understanding how to best onboard them. And then we look at different stages of the customer journey of basically where are they at? Have they used certain features? Are they actually converting from the content that we're giving them on how to's or something like that? So from that piece of content, Where do they go next? Do they select the login button? Do they actually explore new content? Where are they going? So, by having this kind of attribution framework, you're able to see at what stages of the customer journey maybe they drop off, at what stages of the customer journey do they actually go through to completion, and then go in your product and they start using the feature that you actually educated them about.
Hmm. Hmm. And I know that in my career, I've worked really heavily with some of the data scientists, and I've met one person specifically who is able to build out a model that answers the questions that I have. And and I think one of the biggest challenges, and tell me if this is something that is true for you too, is knowing what questions to ask. Does that sound about right to you?
Sounds about right to me. I think that asking the right questions about what data to actually measure.
Mhm.
So if that is, with Google Analytics, you can get, you know, unique viewers, you can get bounce rate, you can get different, time on page and stuff like that. But when you go deeper into this type of measurement framework, you're really looking at different types of fields. From the data science perspective, they call them fields, which is
Yep.
definitely a little bit different than what we call it. But those fields of, from content group A, do they go to content group B? Or from content group A, do they go and actually convert and log in? Right. So all of
Yeah.
these like touch points are data fields to measure within your framework.
Now you're in the process right now, and I know we've talked about this before, but you're in the process of building out that framework. What are some of the soft skills? Because I know one of the experiences that I've had is even communicating to the data scientists what I want to do and how I want to do it. Because a lot of that process is always like the company is always focused on money in, money out, much easier model to build. How are you communicating that? And what are the soft skills that look like when you're trying to get these things built out?
Yeah. So I think that really you start with communication, right? So you talk to a data scientist or a business analyst or even, someone who's managing different types of like aspects of your analytics department. You really have to talk to them and make a very strong business case. Why are we doing this? How is this actually going to drive impact in some way or another? And then, if it can, is it going to drive revenue? At some point or another? What is the business need for it? And how can you actually utilize it to impact change in the future and to get better results with your content creation? Because content creation is not, flip a button and it's on. It's
Right.
more of being thoughtful about how you're creating this. Are you getting to the right audience? So, in speaking with someone who can actually, do this type of work, not only do you need to create a case, but you also need to understand the systems that they're working with. So then you can actually fill in gaps as you go. So if we know that our backend systems are using Snowflake, for example, I need to understand from, a data scientist or someone in that department, I need to understand what the connection of those disparate systems look like. So if I make a good case in the beginning and say what the value is of this type of attribution, it's it's easier for me to start understanding and opening the door with, with like, someone who I'm working with to get things built. Of course, there's resourcing and time that can be an issue, but getting it prioritized and getting, the value understood, I think is the first soft skill that you need to have.
It's always an interesting thing. And being able to communicate the timelines to like realistically the timelines on which this stuff is gonna to happen. Um, okay, so here's my next question, and I think it will lead us into the next sort of segment of the show is once you have that data, right? Once you have sort of this concrete data around what people are consuming, how they're going through the paths, like all of that, how are you then incorporating that into your process for planning and the rest of content creation that comes from that?
Yeah. So I think that when you evaluate different data that you collect from content, and from like attribution, what you're really trying to look at is customer behavior. What are they doing? Right? Are they actually interested in what you're creating? And that type of data will then filter back in and say, okay, well, how do we recommend content? Not just create it, not just measure it, but what do we recommend to a customer at their stage of the customer journey? Do we recommend a video because it's a low level of effort? Do we actually bring them to a course like we have DocuSign University? Do we bring them to a course for more intense learning? And then understand, you know, in tandem with this, where are they at in their consumption? Are they healthy? Are they not healthy? What types of content convert to what type of customer you have?
I'm going to
Understanding
stop
that.
you right there for a second.
Yeah.
Define healthy and not healthy, because I think that's really important to the overall conversation on how to communicate what you're trying to measure.
Yeah. So I would say that, our team has really worked hard on creating digital health models to understand consumption. So when you have a healthy customer, they are consuming at a higher rate than someone who is not a healthy customer. And we try and create content that actually caters to where they are, whether they're not consuming because they don't understand the product, or if they're consuming a lot, but then we know that there are additional use cases that can get them to upsell, which is again business value, right? So when we define those zones of health, we really have to use a lot of data to understand, maybe projecting how much they're going to use in the future. For our purposes, it would be how many envelopes do they send? Um, and how many features do they use? So with a healthy customer, you have an opportunity to further their usage. And then with an unhealthy customer, you have the opportunity to save them and keep them as a customer.
I think what's fantastic about that is when I was at QuickBooks, we started to, and this was towards the end of my tenure, but we were able to start looking at what the content that we're producing, how does that impact the lifetime value of an existing customer, which I think is really difficult. I think a lot of executives are looking at the conversation as like, oh, this is a traffic acquisition play. And really getting into the retention side of things, it's kind of foreign, I think, to a lot of people. What is that? Because I know you champion for this. So what is that? What does that look like for you generally, not specifically?
So as far as retention, we've worked with a couple different strategies to understand how we're going to keep a customer, right?
Hmm.
We're it providing like promotional, type of activities really out of our purview. But when we, try and look at these things, we're really trying to understand what keeps a customer. Is it different types of feature adoption? So, we've proven out that if they use more, they're going to stay longer because that product or that feature has value to them. And then, or at least on my end, I haven't done this, but as far as lifetime value, if we can actually mitigate churn by a certain percentage, that will actually cause more lifetime value of the customer, higher retention, higher dollars. And so, we've worked on projects, for example, that have included, when someone tries to cancel, what do we do to try and save them? We provide them content that's useful. Not only, hey, you've used this many envelopes, you've used this many templates, you've done these things. It's not just that, it's how do you use these things? What is the value proposition for you at the end of the day? And then that can mitigate churn, mitigate people from actually canceling the product. So we see content as being integral in saving as well as adopting in the beginning.
Can you give me, mm, and you can tell me no to this, but can you give me an example of a metric that you might see and then match that up to the type of content you need to create?
For that project, we had, a certain amount of content. We had probably 5 or 6 content pieces throughout that process. And I can't tell you the exact percentage, but
Right, of
we were
course.
able to use that content. And also it was heavily dependent on design and how to keep them in in our ecosystem. But we were able to mitigate churn by quite a percentage by giving them not only, the ability to stay with us because they had maybe a promotion or something like that, but what that content is. So we have the ability, this has not been set up just yet, but we have the ability to measure those clicks on each piece of content in that what we call a cancel save flow. So we're able to do that. All of those things need to be set up as part of an attribution framework. But we have the opportunity, which I think is really important, especially because mitigating churn is a huge, huge thing in customer success. It is a main metric that we are measured by, both on the content side, on the sales side, all of those things. So I think it's relatively important and needs to actually, I think in general, probably needs to have more attention paid to it in terms of what you were saying before about lifetime value.
Yeah. And I think what's really neat is that DocuSign is actually thinking about this. Like, was that a challenge for you, or was that something where it was like they were already thinking about this before you came in?
I'm not sure. When I came in, I had championed content attribution for a very long time to get to certain metrics, to get to certain business goals. But I think that our team had been really, really integral in taking feedback from, like leadership about like, what are those metrics? What does success look like for mitigating churn and all of those things? So I think that overall, integrating content into that measurement framework, whether it's churn or adoption or something like that, I think that's something that we're really putting emphasis on now. And we're trying to expand our content development capabilities and also, along with that, the measurement as well.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. So let's transition into the next portion of our show. I want to know a little bit more about your pregame for editing. You've gotten the process, you know what you're going to be creating because the data's informed it. You've created the piece. Now you're going into the edit. Tell me a little bit about what that looks like, and then we'll jump into the actual edit of the document
Sure.
beforehand or afterwards.
So when I write, it's kind of like that stop start mentality where, you write something, I basically word vomit onto a page. I put as much as I can down there. So then the copy editing process is a lot easier. You can always remove, it's harder to continually add. So what I do is I stop start. So when I write a piece, I have to put it aside, whether it's, something that I only have an hour or I have a day. That pregame process really needs to be, down pat, whether it's, me taking that break, listening to music, reading other writers' work just to get inspiration for sentence structure and how to introduce new topics, how to really promote value. So I start and I stop. I listen to music. I do all of the things that really need to get me into that zone. And then, of course, like you go through your copy editing process and you see maybe some holes where you could actually improve. So yeah, I like to do that. And, I like to really think critically and think about the audience while I'm doing it. Because if you're editing for yourself, that's not really helpful. But if
Right.
you're editing to understand like how to best communicate to an audience, I think that that is really key for creating a good piece of content.
I always love this question because we get all sorts of different answers. We had Emily Triplet Lentz on she's from Calendly a little while ago, and she said that she sits on her hands while she reads because it resists the urge to like jump straight into line edits. And personally, I'm someone who has to like really meditate on why somebody would be wanting to read this piece or like have clicked on it or whatever. So it's always a really fascinating thing to kind of see what that pregame looks like for a lot of people. All right, let's hop into, we're at the half hour mark. I'm going to bring up the screen here so we can walk through the edits that you've already done. While I'm doing that, I would love to encourage the audience to take a look at our YouTube channel. We'll put that in the chat here, and that will show you all of our previous episodes, as well as little clips from episodes that we've had throughout. So really nice, fun stuff going on over there. All right, let's bring this up and we will move straight into the edits. There we go. Before we get into it though, what was your first impression of the piece?
I thought it was pretty well written. It was a little bit prescriptive. So it told the customer or the prospect, it told them what to do. It told them really how to think about stuff. And I think that, I actually printed it out. I did red line it, which is funny because I misunderstood the assignment. But really making sure that there were clarifying words, that there was like good sentence structure. But I thought that overall it was pretty well done. There was a little bit of jargon that like could have been clarified, but based on my subject matter expertise, it wasn't necessarily there for me to clarify. But still, I thought that it was a great piece and it didn't need a ton of reworking, but I definitely put some effort in there.
All right, cool. Now let's get into the individual edits that you've brought in here, and maybe some thoughts along the way as to why some of these edits were made, and maybe some things that you would have done a little bit differently if you were in the creation process.
Yeah. So I think that in the beginning, we have, in journalism, we call it a nut graph. So basically, you give the most important information first, and then you go down into, the more descriptive kind of explanation of those things. So I wanted to create a little bit more of like a narrative. So, like the first line basically saying that, like, instead of starting with a client of mine, it's kind of that moment saying, like, after recently repositioning their brand, my client separated. And so I felt like that was kind of like a good way to say, like, all right, well, this is an active way to talk about it. And then, trying to cut some of the words that were a little bit extra, just to get to the point a little bit quicker. Like I was saying in like the nut graph, you want to get there as soon as possible. So yeah, so basically taking out, like you don't need so, or you don't need included. Those types of words that are important, but if you want to make it a little bit shorter and more straightforward, I would say that that is a part of it as well.
How are you keeping those little gotchas? Because I know I just wrote something that was like, I don't know, 2,500 words or something like that. And I've been doing this for a long time and I'm going through. I actually have my wife edit a lot of my stuff because she's way better at it than I am. And all of those little like so's and like the ums, if you will, of the writing. How are you keeping that in mind as you're going through? Because sometimes it's really easy to gloss over.
Well, I like to start my sentences off strong. And when you start with like, and because, or so, or also, or something like that, it may not pack the punch that you're looking for. And so I think that, in looking at how you start a sentence, where you use commas, what words you're using to modify your statement, or your sentence, I think that's really important because it allows you to trim the fat a little bit more and get to the point quicker.
Cool. Let's see. So there are some things in here. I see this a lot, right? We start sentences with but we're throwing commas in there instead. Is that something that you're seeing in the content that you're editing or no?
Um,
Like normally.
Normally some of the content I edit does not have, a but in there because you don't want to have like a negative, like, this is something, but you don't want to have something in there like that when I'm editing a blog or something like that. You really want to have, you know, no run on sentences, but but you want to also provide like more of like a positive tone where, instead of whatever you choose to in this particular sentence, it definitely was it made sense. But really clarifying without juxtaposing, if you will.
Awesome. And then this is yeah, this is a weird one, right? just is something that it can minimize or it can enhance. And you threw it in here. And maybe this is like a little pedantic on my part, but I'm curious about throwing this in at that point.
I think that it makes it their tool doesn't just provide numbers on a dashboard. It does this. So I think that it talks about, what it's there for is to say it's not just this, it's also, so you make like a beginning statement saying, it is not only. You could have, I guess I could have say not only as well. But I think that it was a little bit more like it felt a little bit more impactful based on the structure of the sentence.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I am somebody who I end up having too many just in the bad kind of way. So uh so that's why I asked. Okay, so we're talking about have a lexicon that recognizes the word's meaning and is only part of what it communicates. You said give an example here. What kind of example would you be looking for in this area?
what I would like to see is because it is, it's not merely just a vocabulary list like mentioned before, but basically giving an example of a word that basically has, like it was saying, that a word's meaning is only part of it, what it communicates. So, what word would be a good example of a brand lexicon, right? That would actually convey the lexicon itself. So I would need an example of a brand. But it does have later on in the article, it has, an example of like Zapier, and stuff like that. But framing it for whoever the reader is, giving a word as an example, what might be a little bit more explanatory and it might get the point across a little bit harder.
Talking about the reader, one of the things that I was curious about as I was going through this piece myself was exactly who is the reader? Who would you suspect the reader would be in this particular piece?
I would say
Because
that it was maybe a brand marketer, someone who does a lot of voice and tone, someone who's maybe even a copywriter, someone
yeah,
who is using language to communicate brand value. So that could be a content marketer. That could be, anyone that really touches copy because they're really looking at, and maybe even a brand strategist, someone who's looking at how they're going to convey their brand to an audience, how they're going to convey, you know, looking at it right now, why they would do it, and why it makes sense for their business. So someone who's actually in the building phase of that lexicon.
okay, cool. Did you feel that it was really like, did you feel it was wrong in communicating to that author or to that audience? Because
Yeah.
what I was a little, as I was reading through it myself, one of the things that I was curious about was if that's the case, would I, as a brand marketer, need to know what a brand lexicon was, or would that be something that's kind of the barrier to, like the not barrier to entry, just like part of the entry? Like I would know that already.
I think that based on the audience, sometimes you have to assume that they don't know.
Okay.
In many cases, I have to assume that maybe my customers don't know what something is. So then I can be explanatory, maybe not harp on it too much, but give, okay, this is what it is. Here's an example. Let's move on how to do it, because there is jargon in our industry. And, sometimes we explain with jargon, sometimes we explain with like general topics, and explanations of those topics. And I do think that in this article, it was good that there was, the background, the context for what you're talking about. Because let's just say that someone were to be dropped into the middle of this article, would they kind of have the context to read about it? I think that they would in this particular case, but also the article in and of itself is a little long.
Right.
So you want them to take the high level as much as possible. And then if
So
they're
here's a question.
interested, go right into it.
So here's the next question for you, because I see this a lot, especially with search optimized content, which I know is like not really where you're at, but I know you see it too. Um, Where are you finding the balance between just enough context and not too much?
Yeah, I actually started my career as an SEO copywriter. So
Yeah. So
yeah, so I did, I definitely do. When you're thinking about SEO, thinking about actually having visibility into a topic or an article or something like that, I think that one of the major considerations you need to make is, setting context with appropriate keywords in the beginning. Like that nut graph I was talking about before. You do it as fast as you can in the most competent way that you can. But if we're talking about financial services, for example, you need to make sure that all of the words, not all of them, but the most popular words that are associated with that industry are in there somewhere. And they have a dual purpose. They set the context, but they also actually have SEO value. So when someone searches for DocuSign, banking, templates. It has those three. It has those three words in there somewhere. And having it in the beginning is a good way to set the scene and set the tone for what they're going to read about.
okay. All right. Um, yeah, I don't know if I have any other line of questioning on that. Let's see. So you have you have this idea, right? What are you using? Because I like the idea of context, and I want to stay on this sort of line of thinking with context. And we've talked about attribution, and we know what success looks like with attribution and what that plays with the retention process. When we're looking at context in the stuff that's playing a role in retention, right? How
Mhm.
are you using the data to start to determine how much context you need to give? I think that's the question I want to ask.
Would you say that this would be more of the copywriting element, or would you
Yeah.
say this more? Okay, so
Yeah, the copywriting element.
I would say that for those engagement metrics, like click through rate from a CTA or the fact that they opened it, they read it, right? If you're not providing the right context in the beginning for why they should care, I think that's one of the most important things. They're going to learn it eventually, right? If they're going to stick with you as a company, they're going to learn how to use a certain feature that you provide, but they need to understand why they're doing it.
Mm,
And we've really focused a little bit more on, value prop messaging to really give them the context of, if you're going to use this product, here is why it's going to speed up your time to value. It's going to close deals quicker. It's going to do all of this stuff. And then here's how you can do it. And so I think that setting that context as, why should they care in the copywriting, in the actual like email that we're sending them is super important, and to be engaging as well. So we know, for example, that subject lines, that do very well, they have a high open rate, or, CTAs that are clicked on. Clearly, the message and the value has been, you know, promoted to the customer. So then they will click on the CTA. I think that those two things are really important in the copywriting process for sure. And by setting context in the beginning, they understand what they're reading. They understand why. And the why is a huge part of it.
Are you doing any qualitative research to like kind of match that up or periodically, or is this something that you know enough already to inform what you're creating along the way?
Well, we have two things. We do have past metrics, so engagement metrics from prior campaigns. We A B test, we iterate upon it. So that's one data source on a quantitative level. On a qualitative level, I have several colleagues that have been conducting customer interviews, understanding, different aspects of, their pain points, what we can provide them. And then we take that, we create, a strategy around it, and then content is kind of filled in as we go. Because that qualitative research is super important. I don't touch that specifically right now, but my colleagues are really great at it, and they've done an excellent job of conveying why we're doing it. What is the strategy behind it? Do they need additional use cases to understand how to use a product or why they should use it. They have a certain amount of product to use left. Why should they use it, right? And that's like we've come to the conclusion, in recent, research, that we need to continue to expand their use cases so then they can use more documents that they send out through DocuSign because they know the value. But also it's like, how do I use this? Why do I use this? What
Right.
documents I use for this?
And if I can fill in the gaps here, so what's happening is you're getting this qualitative research along with the stuff that you know what works based on your historical quantitative research. You're able to fill in those gaps and then start to look at the models that you have in place where it says, okay, we want to improve retention, for this particular part, or we want, let me rephrase that. Retention's not a great word because that's a very broad term. We want to have people send out more envelopes within this period of time. We're going to send them XYZ things based on the feedback that we've gotten before, based on what we know is happening within subjects and everything else. And then you have this sort of full funnel approach. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of how we're doing it. I think that collecting the data is probably the hardest part. For the quantitative, it's really easy to do an A/B test, figure out what subject line works, figure out what type of strategy we're going to go with, whether it's multiple pieces of content in one email, so multiple CTAs, one CTA. Like what is the structure that's converting the best? And then when it comes to like the qualitative, we need to understand why the customer is or is not using.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what's interesting about that whole conversation too, overall, is deciding what metrics you need to even be caring about in the first place. Cause I know that I've seen this, I've done this where you're measuring for the sake of measuring. And then you're like, I have all of this stuff. All right. What do I do with it? Right. So, can you talk about that a little bit more? We haven't really covered that. And then I think we could wrap it up pretty soon here, but can you talk about that? How are you sort of pulling the levers, I suppose, on which things to focus on and prioritize in what it is that you're trying to do?
From the content perspective, what I'm trying to do as far as, prioritizing and things like that, um, prioritization comes top down. We all know that. But as far as utilizing some of this data, it's kind of like for separate elements. So for copywriting, we will use these engagement metrics to understand the efficacy and the overall success of the copy. For content, that's where I jump right into attribution because we don't have a ton of metrics. How I can't say exactly how we do it, but we do more of a correlative model as opposed to a causal model. And so we can actually connect the dots. It's not direct attribution though. So if we, like I said before, like if we know that a video performs better with a CTA, right? A video performs better than a technical article. We're probably going to use the video in the future for another A/B test or for a hypothesis within a strategy. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the correlative model is actually like something to really think about when you're communicating all of that as well as like, because I think a lot of people want to say, we did this, so we get this. And it's like, it's not always how it works, right? So, cool. Well, I want to wrap it up. I think we've had a great conversation here. Is there anything else that I didn't ask that you think we should know as an audience?
Writing is hard. I writing is hard. You really have to understand the subject matter that you're going to talk about, that you're going to write about. And I think that I mentor a couple writers that are very early in their careers, and I think being able to really hone in on what it is that you want to convey. What is the message? How do you want to convey it? What are your levers that you can pull to to basically promote your message, whether it's like social media to promote a blog, or if it's, you know, different types, we've explored like in product content. Do you want to do that in product? Do you want to do that outside of the product? What would you like to do? Make sure that you fully understand who your audience is, how you're going to communicate to them, and then what channels you're going to use to actually promote your message. So,
Fantastic. Melissa, thank you so much for coming on to the show tonight. I really appreciate it.
having me, I really appreciate it also.